Imagine waking up before dawn, not to an alarm clock, but to the fear of another brutal day of work. No coffee, no comfort, just pain, filth, and the constant risk of death, all for a few coins, or sometimes nothing at all. Throughout most of history, people didn't get to choose a career. They inherited one, born into poverty, forced into labor most of us today can barely imagine. Today we're stepping back in time to meet the workers behind history's darkest, dirtiest, and most dangerous jobs. From the tunnels of coal mines to the sewers beneath medieval streets, these are the worst jobs in human history, and by the end, you'll never complain about your Monday morning again. Let's start in medieval England, in the dead of night, with a job whispered about in disgusted tones: the gong farmer. Before modern plumbing, someone had to empty the cesspits and privies of an entire town by hand, in the dark, using nothing but a wooden bucket and a shovel. The smell was so overwhelming that gong farmers were legally banned from working during daylight hours, forced to do their filthy business only after sunset. They waded through human waste, scooped it into buckets, and hauled it through narrow alleys to waiting carts, all while trying not to breathe too deeply. Strangely enough, this disgusting job paid surprisingly well, sometimes more than a skilled carpenter, because almost nobody else was willing to do it. Gong farmers often lived on the edge of town, shunned by neighbors who couldn't stand the smell clinging to their clothes and skin. Some died from toxic fumes trapped in deep pits, poisoned by the very waste they were paid to remove. It was steady income, but it came at the cost of dignity, health, and often a very short life. Next, we descend into darkness, literally, with the coal miners of the industrial age. Mines needed workers small enough to fit into narrow tunnels, so children as young as 5 were sent underground, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours a day. Armed with a small pickaxe, they crawled through tunnels barely wide enough for their bodies, chipping away at coal seams in air thick with dust. Many pushed heavy carts loaded with coal through passages, so cramped they couldn't stand up straight. Lanterns provided the only light, and a sudden gas leak or a collapsing tunnel could end a life in seconds. Children developed chronic coughs, stunted growth, and lungs blackened before they even reached adulthood. Overseers pushed them to work faster, with little regard for injury or exhaustion, because coal meant profit, and profit came first. Some children never saw daylight for weeks at a time, sleeping in shifts near the mine entrance just to save the walk home. It's hard to imagine a childhood spent entirely underground, breathing coal dust instead of fresh air. But for millions of families, that was simply survival. Now let's talk about one of history's strangest and most stomach-turning jobs, the leech collector. In the era before modern medicine, doctors believed bloodletting could cure almost anything, and leeches were the tool of choice. To gather them, poor workers waded barefoot into muddy ponds and let the leeches attach directly to their legs. Once several had latched on, the leeches were peeled off, one by one, and dropped into a bucket to be sold to physicians. It sounds almost comical today, but leech collectors risked blood loss, infection, and disease with every wade into the water. Their legs were constantly scarred and swollen from bites, and the job paid barely enough to survive. Still, for a while, demand for leeches was so high that this miserable, itchy profession became a genuine part of the medical supply chain. Few jobs capture pure childhood horror quite like chimney sweeping. Small, thin boys were sent up narrow, pitch-black chimney shafts to scrape away soot, using nothing but their elbows, knees, and bare hands. Some chimneys twisted and narrowed so tightly that boys became stuck, trapped in complete darkness, unable to move up or down. Soot filled their lungs with every breath, and many later developed a horrific illness nicknamed chimney sweep's disease. Falls, burns, and suffocation were constant threats, and tragically, some boys never made it back down alive. Employers often chose the smallest, youngest children specifically because they could squeeze into the tightest spaces. When they finally emerged, covered head to toe in black soot, exhaustion was the only reward waiting for them. Along with another chimney, entire civilizations were built stone by stone, block by block, using nothing but raw human muscle. In quarries across the ancient and medieval world, laborers cut, lifted, and hauled massive stone blocks that could weigh more than a car. Ropes and simple pulleys helped, but most of the brutal work still came down to human backs and straining arms. Workers pushed heavy blocks over log rollers, dragged them up ramps, and chipped away at solid rock with hand tools for hours on end. Overseers watched closely, often pushing laborers past safe limits to meet impossible deadlines set by kings or wealthy patrons. Crushed limbs, broken bones, and fatal falls were common, and the physical toll shortened countless lives. Yet the workers rarely received recognition. Their names were lost to history, while the castles, temples, and monuments they built still stand today as symbols of someone else's glory. Every ancient wonder we admire hides a story of exhausted, anonymous hands that made it possible. In crowded medieval cities, rats weren't just pests. They were a genuine threat, spreading disease through filthy streets and homes. Enter the rat catcher, who prowled dark alleys at night armed with little more than a stick, a sack, and a strong stomach. Rat catchers crawled through narrow gaps, reached into rotting crates, and grabbed live rats with their bare hands, risking painful bites and infection with every catch. Because rats were known carriers of deadly plagues, this job placed workers directly in the path of disease outbreaks that could wipe out entire towns. Pay came per rat caught, meaning income was unpredictable and often barely enough to survive on. It was a job built entirely on desperation, dangerous, disgusting, and utterly essential to keeping a city's population from collapsing under filth and infestation. If you think the smells so far were bad, the tannery took things to a whole new level. To turn stiff animal hides into usable leather, tanners had to soak them in a mixture that often included stale urine and animal waste, which helped soften and treat the material. Workers stood for hours stirring hides inside giant barrels, their hands raw and cracked from constant exposure to harsh chemicals. The stench was so overpowering that tanneries were usually built on the outskirts of town, far from anyone who could avoid the smell. Skin irritation, respiratory problems, and chronic infections were simply part of daily life for tannery workers. Despite the horror of the process, leather was essential for shoes, armor, and tools, meaning someone always had to do this stomach-churning, thankless work. Finally, we arrive at perhaps the most feared job of all, working alongside death itself. Gravediggers and executioners' assistants handled the darkest tasks a medieval town required, digging pits for plague victims, or preparing grounds outside castle walls for punishment and burial. This work carried deep social stigma. These workers were often shunned, feared, and forced to live apart from the rest of the community. Digging through hard, cold earth for hours left hands blistered and backs aching, all while carrying the psychological weight of constant exposure to death. Some assisted in executions directly, a task so disturbing that many turned to drink just to endure it. Despite the fear and isolation surrounding this work, someone always had to do it, because in every era, death waits for no one, and someone must prepare the ground. From sewage to soot, from leeches to graves, these workers remind us just how much of history was built on suffering that rarely gets remembered. Next time your job feels exhausting, remember the boy hauling waste through midnight streets, or the child crawling through a coal seam just to survive another day. We've come a long way, but it's worth pausing to appreciate just how far. Which of these jobs shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through history's worst jobs, subscribe for more stories the history books tend to leave out.